The early 1800s weren't when Americans discovered capitalism. It's when they were dragged into it, many of them against their will. The market revolution didn't spread like an idea. It was built, enforced, and legislated, brick by brick and lawsuit by lawsuit. What Thomas Jefferson feared, his successors quietly constructed. What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I laid out Chapter 1 of Charles Sellers' The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846. I talked about how he lays out the world of subsistence farmers, of artisans and mechanics and other kinds of laborers, and what they were fighting to defend as it looked like their world was about to change. In this episode, I'm going to discuss Chapter 2 of Sellers' book with a little bit of help from other resources. This one gets into the origins of the market revolution in the early 1800s. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Liking, subscribing, spreading the word about the channel is the best possible way to ensure that I get to keep doing this. So if you're enjoying it, as I'm enjoying doing it, please, please, please like, subscribe, let other people know about it. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. As usual, I will share my resources with you guys for this episode. Obviously, it's going to be Charles Sellers' The Market Revolution. That's the first of them. But I'll be sticking with the same resources I used from the last episode. That is The American Pageant, which is a common AP US history textbook, college history textbook. There's also Give Me Liberty, which is another of the same thing, a common AP US history / college level textbook. And then there is What Hath God Wrought by Daniel Walker Howe. This is the book that covers this period from the Oxford History of the United States series. It's also very, very good. Won a Pulitzer Prize, as a matter of fact. And I'll be using these resources to talk about this period for the next probably 6 weeks or so at least. And as usual, I've got a question for you guys to think about to help hopefully tie all this information together, connect the dots in some way. Here goes. What were the factors and who were the individuals who took the lead in both government and private enterprise when it came to pushing the U.S. and its citizens away from subsistence agriculture and small-scale manufacturing toward a much larger and more sophisticated market economy? I'll say that one more time. What were the factors and who were the individuals who took the lead in both government and private enterprise when it came to pushing the U.S. and its citizens away from subsistence agriculture and small-scale manufacturing and toward a much larger and more sophisticated market economy? So think about that as I go through all of the specifics. I think it will help you to absorb the information and tie it all together. Without further ado, here we go. In Chapter 1 of The Market Revolution, Charles Sellers painted a picture of a subsistence economy. Households producing for themselves, bound by family labor and reciprocity, wary of debt and markets. Chapter 2 shows how that world was pried open. The market revolution did not simply arrive like weather. It was built piece by piece through infrastructure projects, court rulings, legislative charters, and financial institutions. This chapter makes it clear that the rise of market capitalism, the market economy in America, was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate policy choices that privileged commerce, credit, and corporations over local custom and subsistence independence. Sellers opens Chapter 2 not with canals and steamboats, but with politics. He reminds us that the Republican Party was born out of resistance to a federalist vision of a creditor-dominated commercial republic. Jefferson and his followers imagined a nation of independent farmers, free from banks, debt, and a factory system that they feared would turn Americans into a European-style proletariat. Yet, as Republicans consolidated power in the early 1800s, they found themselves drawn into the very processes that they had once distrusted. Population growth strained the supply of land, while rising commerce tempted farmers and artisans with new opportunities. State legislatures, which were dominated by Republicans, chartered banks, incorporated business, and encouraged commerce in a variety of ways. This is all while insisting that they remain true to agrarian ideals. I would say that the shift was less a betrayal and more a redefinition of the party. Republicans began to argue that expanding markets and infrastructure could open opportunity rather than destroy it. Where Jefferson feared dependency, his successors saw access. Credit for small farmers, roads for Western settlers, canals to link interior towns to seaports. Even Madison was not so idealistic as his political patriarch. He realized, did Madison, that farmers needed the carrot of potential profits to work hard and produce more in a way that would benefit all Americans. By the 1810s, the irony was clear. The party that had once championed subsistence independence was now laying the legal and financial foundations of the market revolution. States borrowed heavily, they issued bonds, and they launched ambitious improvement projects. In doing so, they politicized the market itself, creating winners and losers through legislative action. For markets to dominate, goods had to move. Sellers writes about the explosion in transportation improvements that collapsed distances and knit towns, cities, and seaport communities together. In the early 1800s, legislatures issued hundreds of charters for turnpike companies. These roads were rarely profitable for their investors, but they reshaped local economies by tying farm towns to market centers. Paying tolls replaced neighborly favors to some degree. Time and mileage became the new measures of value. Fulton and Livingston's launch of the Clermont, which was the first ever steamboat, in 1807 demonstrated that upstream travel was possible. By the 1810s, steamboats filled up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, cutting the cost of sending produce from west to east. Sellers stresses that this was not just technology, but also law. New York's attempt to grant Fulton and Livingston a steamboat monopoly was overturned in Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. The Supreme Court ruled that the kind of interstate commerce between New Jersey and New York that Livingston and Fulton were hoping to run was under the jurisdiction of the federal government, and a monopoly could not be granted by the state of New York. The decision cleared the waterways for competition and pretended the ways in which the courts would favor commerce. States took the lead in digging canals, the most transformative of which was the Erie Canal, which was begun in 1817 and finally completed by 1825, actually in record time from the perspective of most people who approved the project and who worked on it. It was kind of remarkable to everybody how quickly it got done. The Erie Canal cut transport costs, connected the Great Lakes Basin to the Atlantic region, and diverted trade away from Baltimore and Philadelphia. The Erie Canal made New York City the unrivaled commercial hub of the new, young republic. Geography gave New York City a deep harbor and the Hudson-Mohawk corridor. Policy turned those assets into dominance. Merchants built the urban superstructure. Warehouses, auction houses, commission agencies, insurance firms, shipping news, and price circulars that rippled outward to country merchants. New York's legislature also led in corporate and banking charters throughout the country, while its courts proved extremely friendly to commercial interests. By the 1820s, New York was setting commodity prices for the entire nation. This was not natural growth, but the triumph of deliberate state action working hand in glove with private enterprise. Secretary of Treasury to both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Albert Gallatin, proposed in 1808 a network of canals and roads that would connect the entire country's infrastructure and allow commerce to more easily take place between different localities. But constitutional doubts and two presidential vetoes, one by Madison in 1817, one by James Monroe in 1822, left most of this work to the states and not the federal government. States borrowed and taxed to finance these internal improvements, shouldering debts they hoped would pay off through the growth in commerce. Legislatures handed out charters to turnpike companies and canal companies. They also guaranteed bonds and used eminent domain to seize private property that stood in the way of these infrastructure projects. This made government the midwife, if you will, of markets. The routes of commerce were chosen not by the market alone, but by political decisions, mostly in state houses. Winners and losers were created by legislative choice. Just as important as roads and canals was the legal revolution that accompanied them. Sellers devotes careful attention to the way that courts reshaped daily life. The rising dominance of new legal standards created a system in which contracts and compacts were valued over custom. In subsistence culture, obligations were flexible. A bad harvest might excuse a debt, but in the legal system of the market economy, courts increasingly enforced contracts to the letter, binding farmers and artisans to fixed schedules of payment. This is one more factor that shifted communities from the standard of communal reciprocity to the impersonal and standardized rules of the market. Another Supreme Court case that illustrates the ways in which legal standards transformed the society and economy of the early republic is Dartmouth v. Woodward. This was a Supreme Court case in 1819 in which the Supreme Court ruled that corporate charters were contracts protected from state interference. This meant that once privileges were granted to a corporation, like toll rights or banking powers, they could not easily be revoked. It gave investors confidence that their capital would be protected by the law. And that's an important step forward in this system, which is going to become more impersonal and involve more money over greater distances between strangers. Another really important court case is McCulloch v. Maryland, also in 1819. This case upheld the constitutionality of the Second Bank of the United States, chartered toward the end of James Madison's presidency. The ruling issued by the court denied states the ability to tax the Bank of the United States. Together with the Gibbons case, the court declared that the national government would protect interstate commerce from state government interference. The point is this: the courts became the active builders of the market revolution. They discarded ancient customs of local fairness in favor of legal standards that maximize the commercial capacity of the country. In the early republic, corporations were rare and created typically for narrow public purposes. British law had in fact restricted tightly the number of corporations that could be chartered in the colonies. There was a grand total, in fact, of only 7 corporate charters that were issued during the colonial period. By comparison, 40 corporate charters were issued in the first decade after independence, and 300 were formed in the boom years of the 1790s. By the 1810s, this was changing even more rapidly. Another good example that illustrates what's going on here is the New York Incorporation Law of 1811. The law allowed manufacturing corporations to form much more easily than they'd been able to before. And that set a broader precedent for the usage of the corporate legal structure throughout the entire country. Corporations were important to people who wanted to form businesses because of what they offered. Specifically, corporations offered 2 things that were very attractive to potential investors. One is limited liability, a legal shield, if you will, for any business an investor might get involved in. And secondarily, a corporation allowed individuals to get together, pool their capital, and put a business in place without risking everything that they had financially. This structure allowed things like banks, canals, and factories to grow greater in number because risk and profit could be distributed among many individuals. Corporations, Sellers argues, was not a natural evolution of business, if you will. They were political creations, born of legislative favor and legal protection. They concentrated wealth and power, and they tilted the economy decisively toward large-scale enterprise. Sellers also makes clear that the decisive reshaping of the law to the demands of the market was not happening in legislatures, but in courts. Lawyers and judges, Federalist and Republican alike, were the ones who converted democratic rhetoric into binding capitalist practice. The legal profession itself exploded in size after independence. As commerce expanded, merchants abandoned the informal arbitration process that had dominated disputes and instead turned to lawyers and courts to enforce ever larger and more complex contractual relationships. This proliferation of legal disputes created a demand for the legal profession that had scarcely existed in the colonial subsistence order. Sellers quite memorably calls lawyers the shock troops of capitalism. They weren't just observers or intermediaries. They actively drafted contracts and charters, defended creditors, and served corporate interests. Even criminal courts shifted their focus at this time. Where colonial courts had typically enforced things like communal morality, prosecuting drunkenness, blasphemy, or other offenses against local norms, by the early 19th century, they were primarily enforcing property rights and market relationships. The very definition of law and order was being reoriented around the desires of capitalist enterprises. In this way, lawyers and judges became some of the most important architects of the market revolution. They provided the legal scaffolding that allowed corporations, creditors, and speculators to flourish, making the market not just a matter of economics, but a system upheld by the law at every turn. While courts and corporations were reshaping the economy from the ground up, political leaders were doing the same from the top down. Sellers highlights two figures in particular, Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. These legislative leaders of Congress emerged as champions of a national program of economic development. Both men began as Jeffersonian Republicans, suspicious of concentrated power and protective of local independence. But the disruptions of the War of 1812 and the lure of economic growth pushed them into very different kinds of ideologies. Clay, who was a gifted orator and the erstwhile Speaker of the House, became the architect of what he called the American system. He advocated for federally supported internal improvements like canals, bridges, and roads, a protective tariff to shield Americans from foreign competition, and a national bank to stabilize credit. Clay saw these measures as the path to binding the sprawling United States together and spreading prosperity across the Union. Calhoun, likewise, began as a nationalist reformer. In the wake of the War of 1812, he pushed hard for federally funded roads and canals, arguing that this infrastructure would provide security to the country by easing the movement of various military units. Calhoun also insisted that internal transportation improvements would simultaneously expand economic opportunity for Western farmers and Southern planters, granting them greater access to the markets. His support for a strong national government and for vigorous economic development, funded largely by the federal government, would later give way to sectionalism and a defense of slavery. But in this period, he stood alongside Clay as a leading advocate for the expansion of the market economy. Its embrace of figures like Clay and Calhoun showed just how far the Republican Party had strayed from its original vision under the likes of Thomas Jefferson. What had been a party of agrarian independence was now generating leaders who promulgated federal government support for projects like banks, charters, tariffs, and infrastructure as the very engines of economic growth. Infrastructure and law alone would have meant little without capital. Banks provided capital, and they were absolutely critical to the commercial explosion of the 1790s and afterward. But banks didn't just provide capital. So-called hard money was in very short supply in the United States. Banks, through their own paper currencies, provided a medium of exchange that could greatly increase the velocity of money and the overall supply of capital. The number of transactions made possible by this dynamic exploded, as did the number of business ventures that could come into existence and expand potential business opportunities to all Americans. State legislatures chartered hundreds of banks in this period, each issuing notes and extending credit. The Bank of the U.S. provided stability while it existed, but state banks very much resented its power over their own lending capacities, as well as the way it competed with them for business. For merchants and entrepreneurs, banks were lifelines, enabling expansion and speculation. For farmers and artisans, banks were more of a double-edged sword. Easy credit presented farmers and artisans who could become merchants with many different opportunities. They could expand their holdings and reap the profits. But going into debt could also mean default and foreclosure and the loss of independence that was anathema to the subsistence farming ethos. The proliferation of banks supported by state charters and often engaging in recklessly speculative practices deepened the divide between those who positioned themselves to profit from the new system and those on the other side of the ledger who felt hemmed in by it. By the end of Chapter 2, Sellers makes it clear that the market revolution was not an inevitable consensual process of progress. It was engineered through laws, charters, and infrastructure, and it created sharp divides. The winners included merchants, investors, and corporations, as well as lawyers who could leverage legal protections and investment. The losers were frequently small farmers, artisans, and wage laborers who found that their independence was eroded by debt, competition, the unpredictable market, and sometimes foreclosure when debts couldn't be paid. The courts and legislatures tilted the playing field toward commerce, leaving subsistence producers increasingly vulnerable. Chapter 2 reveals that the market revolution was less about invention and more about institutional construction. Roads, canals, and steamboats made transport of goods and people far cheaper. Courts enforced contracts and protected corporations. States handed out charters, while banks made credit much more readily available. New York arose as the nation's commercial capital, not by chance, but by prudent investment and geographical good fortune. Sellers leaves us with the realization that this was not simply economic modernization. It was a political project, one that deliberately replaced the values of subsistence culture with the impersonal, creditor-centered values of the new market. So that's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. I appreciate it as always. If you'd like to reach out with any comments, questions, suggestions, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear it. You can email me at howthehelldomwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can leave a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks very much. Take care, and I will see you all next time.